Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 1, Chapter 9, The Crisis, July 24 to July 30. Prepare, prepare the iron helm of war, bring forth the lots cast in the spacious orb. The angel of fate turns them with mighty hands, and casts them out upon the darkened earth. Prepare, prepare. Quote by Blake. The cabinet on Friday afternoon sat long revolving the Irish problem. The Buckingham Palace conference had broken down. The disagreements and antagonisms seemed as fierce and as hopeless as ever. Yet the margin in dispute upon which such fateful issues hung was inconceivably petty. The discussion turned principally upon the boundaries of Fermanagh and Tyrone. To this pass had the Irish factions in their insensate warfare been able to drive their respective British champions. Upon the disposition of these clusters of humble parishes turned at that moment the political future of Great Britain. The North would not agree to this, and the South would not agree to that. Both the leaders wished to settle. Both had dragged their followers forward to the utmost point they dared. Neither seemed able to give an inch. Meanwhile, the settlement of Ireland must carry with it an immediate and decisive abatement of party strife in Britain, and those schemes of unity and cooperation which had so intensely appealed to the leading men on both sides, ever since Mr. Lloyd George had mooted them in 1910, must necessarily have come forward into the light of day. The failure to settle, on the other hand, meant something very like civil war and the plunge into depths of which no one could make any measure. And so, turning this way and that in search of an exit from the tow deadlock, the cabinet toiled around the muddy byways of Fermanagh and Tyrone. One had hoped that the events of April at the Carré and in Belfast would have shocked British public opinion and formed a unity sufficient to impose a settlement on the Irish factions. Apparently they had been insufficient. Apparently the conflict would be carried one stage further by both sides with incalculable consequences before there would be a recoil. Since the days of the Blues and the Greens in the Byzantine Empire, partisanship had rarely been carried to more absurd extremes. An all-sufficient shock was, however, at hand. The discussion had reached its inconclusive end, and the cabinet was about to separate, when the quiet, grave tones of Sir Edward Grey's voice were heard reading a document which had just been brought to him from the Foreign Office. It was the Austrian note to Serbia. He had been reading or speaking for several minutes before I could disengage my mind from the tedious and bewildering debate which had just closed. We were all very tired, but gradually, as the phrases and sentences followed one another, impressions of a wholly different character began to form in my mind. This note was clearly an ultimatum, but it was an ultimatum such as had never been penned in modern times. As the reading proceeded, it seemed absolutely impossible that any state in the world could accept it, or that any acceptance, however abject, would satisfy the aggressor. The parishes of Fermanagh and Tyrone faded back into the mists and squalls of Ireland, and a strange light began immediately, but by perceptible gradations, to fall and grow upon the map of Europe. I always take the greatest interest in reading accounts of how the war came upon different people, where they were and what they were doing, when the first impression broke on their mind, and they first began to feel this overwhelming event laying its fingers on their lives. I never tire of the smallest detail, and I believe that so long as they are true and unstudied, they will have a definite value and an enduring interest for posterity, so I shall briefly record exactly what happened to me. I went back to the Admiralty at about 6 o'clock. I said to my friends, Mr. Marsh and Mr. Masterton Smith, who have helped me so many years in my work, that there was real danger and that it might be war. I took stock of the position and wrote out, to focus them in my mind, a series of points which would have to be attended to if matters did not mend. My friends kept these as a check during the days that followed and ticked them off one by one as they were settled. First and Second Fleets, leave and disposition. Second, Third Fleet, replenish coal and stores. Third, Mediterranean movements. Fourth, China dispositions. Fifth, shadowing cruisers abroad. Sixth, ammunition for self-defense merchantmen. Seventh, patrol flotillas, disposition, leave, complete, 35 ex-coastals. Eighth, immediate reserve. Ninth, old battleships for Humber, flotilla for Humber. 10th, ships at emergency dates, shipbuilding for foreign powers. 11th, coastal watch. 12th, anti-aircraft guns at oil depots. 13th, aircraft to Sheerness, airships and seaplanes. 14th, K espionage. 15th, magazines and other vulnerable points. 16th, Irish ships. 17th, submarine dispositions. I discussed the situation at length the next morning on Saturday with the First Sea Lord. For the moment, however, there was nothing to do. At no time in all these last 3 years were we more completely ready. The test mobilization had been completed, and with the exception of the immediate reserve, all the reservists were already paid off and journeying to their homes. But the whole of the First and Second Fleets were complete in every way for battle and were concentrated at Portland, where they were to remain till Monday morning at 7 o'clock, when the First Fleet would disperse by squadrons for various exercises, and when the ships of the Second Fleet would proceed to their home ports to discharge their balance crews. Up till Monday morning, therefore, a word instantaneously transmitted from the wireless masts of the Admiralty to the Iron Duke would suffice to keep our main force together. If the word were not spoken before that hour, they would begin to separate. During the first 24 hours after their separation, they could be reconcentrated in an equal period. But if no word were spoken for 48 hours, that is by Wednesday morning, then the ships of the Second Fleet would have begun dismissing their balance crews to the shore at Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham, and the various gunnery and torpedo schools would have recommenced their instruction. If another 48 hours had gone before the word was spoken, that is by Friday morning, a certain number of vessels would have gone into dock for refit, repairs, or laying up. Thus, on the Saturday morning, we had the fleet in hand for at least 4 days. The night before, Friday, at dinner, I had met Herr Ballin. He had just arrived from Germany. We sat next to each other, and I asked him what he thought about the situation. With the first few words he spoke, it became clear that he had not come here on any mission of pleasure. He said the situation was grave. I remember, he said, old Bismarck telling me, the year before he died, that one day the great European war would come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. These words, he said, might come true. It all depended on the Tsar. What would he do if Austria chastised Serbia? A few years before there would have been no danger, as the Tsar was too frightened for his throne. But now again he was feeling himself more secure upon his throne, and the Russian people, besides, would feel very hardly anything done against Serbia. Then he said, "If Russia marches against Austria, we must march, and if we march, France must march, and what would England do?" I was not in a position to say more than that it would be a great mistake to assume that England would necessarily do nothing, and I added that she would judge events as they arose. He replied, speaking with very great earnestness, "Suppose we had to go to war with Russia and France, and suppose we defeated France and yet took nothing from her in Europe, not an inch of her territory, only some colonies to indemnify us. Would that make a difference to England's attitude? Suppose we gave a guarantee beforehand." I stuck to my formula that England would judge events as they arose, and that it would be a mistake to assume that we should stand out of it whatever happened. I reported this conversation to Sir Edward Grey in due course, and early in the following week I repeated it to the Cabinet. On the Wednesday following, the exact proposal mooted to me by Herr Ballin about Germany not taking any territorial conquests in France, but seeking indemnities only in the colonies, was officially telegraphed to us from Berlin, and immediately rejected. I have no doubt that Herr Ballin was directly charged by the Emperor with the mission to find out what England would do. Herr Ballin has left on record his impression of his visit to England at this juncture. "Even a moderately skilled German diplomatist," he wrote, "could easily have come to an understanding with England and France, who could have made peace certain and prevented Russia from beginning war." The editor of his memoirs adds, "The people in London were certainly seriously concerned at the Austrian note, but the extent to which the Cabinet desired the maintenance of peace may be seen as an example from the remark which Churchill, almost with tears in his eyes, made to Ballin as they parted. 'My dear friend, don't let us go to war.' I had planned to spend the Sunday with my family at Cromer, and I decided not to alter my plans. I arranged to have a special operator placed in the telegraph office so as to ensure a continuous night and day service. On Saturday afternoon the news came in that Serbia had accepted the ultimatum. I went to bed with a feeling things might blow over. We had had, as this account has shown, so many scares before. Time after time the clouds had loomed up, vague, menacing, constantly changing. Time after time they had dispersed. We were still a long way, as it seemed, from any danger of war. Serbia had accepted the ultimatum. Could Austria demand more? And if war came, could it not be confined to the east of Europe? Could not France and Germany, for instance, stand aside and leave Russia and Austria to settle their quarrel? And then, one step further removed, was our own case. Clearly, there would be a chance of a conference. There would be time for Sir Edward Grey to get to work with conciliatory processes such as had proved so effective in the Balkan difficulties the year before. Anyhow, whatever happened, the British Navy had never been in a better condition or in greater strength. Probably the call would not come, but if it did, it could not come in a better hour. Reassured by these reflections, I slept peacefully, and no summons disturbed the silence of the night. At 9 o'clock the next morning I called up the First Sea Lord by telephone. He told me that there was a rumor that Austria was not satisfied with the Serbian acceptance of the ultimatum, but otherwise there were no new developments. I asked him to call me up again at 12. I went down to the beach and played with the children. We dammed the little rivulets which trickled down to the sea as the tide went out. It was a very beautiful day. The North Sea shone and sparkled to a far horizon. What was there beyond that line where sea and sky melted into one another? All along the east coast from Cromarty to Dover, in their various sally ports, lay our patrol flotillas of destroyers and submarines. In the channel behind the torpedo-proof moles of Portland Harbor waited all the great ships of the British Navy. Away to the northeast, across the sea that stretched before me, the German High Sea Fleet, squadron by squadron, was cruising off the Norwegian coast. At 12 o'clock I spoke to the First Sea Lord again. He told me various items of news that had come in from different capitals, none, however, of decisive importance, but all tending to a rise of temperature. I asked him whether all the reservists had already been dismissed. He told me they had. I decided to return to London. I told him I would be with him at 9, and that, meanwhile, he should do whatever was necessary. Prince Louis awaited me at the Admiralty. The situation was evidently degenerating. Special editions of the Sunday papers showed intense excitement in nearly every European capital. The First Sea Lord told me that, in accordance with our conversation, he had told the fleet not to disperse. I took occasion to refer to this 4 months later in my letter accepting his resignation. I was very glad publicly to testify at that moment of great grief and pain for him that his loyal hand had sent the first order which began our vast naval mobilization. I then went round to Sir Edward Grey, who had rented my house at 33 Eccleston Square. No one was with him except Sir William Tyrrell of the Foreign Office. I told him that we were holding the fleet together. I learned from him that he viewed the situation very gravely. He said there was a great deal yet to be done before a really dangerous crisis was reached, but that he did not at all like the way in which this business had begun. I asked whether it would be helpful or the reverse if we stated in public that we were keeping the fleet together. Both he and Tyrrell were most insistent that we should proclaim it at the earliest possible moment. It might have the effect of sobering the Central Powers and steadying Europe. I went back to the Admiralty, sent for the First Sea Lord, and drafted the necessary communiqué. The next morning the following notice appeared in all the papers. British naval measures. Orders to First and Second Fleets. No maneuver leave. We received the following statement from the Secretary of the Admiralty at an early hour this morning. Orders have been given to the First Fleet, which is concentrated at Portland, not to disperse for maneuver leave for the present. All vessels of the Second Fleet are remaining at their home ports in proximity to their balance crews. On Monday began the first of the cabinets on the European situation, which thereafter continued daily or twice a day. It is to be hoped that sooner or later a detailed account of the movement of opinion in the cabinet during this period will be compiled and given to the world. There is certainly no reason for anyone to be ashamed of honest and sincere counsel given either to preserve peace or to enter upon a just and necessary war. Meanwhile, it is only possible, without breach of constitutional propriety, to deal in the most general terms with what took place. The cabinet was overwhelmingly pacific. At least 3/4 of its members were determined not to be drawn into a European quarrel, unless Great Britain were herself attacked, which was not likely. Those who were in this mood were inclined to believe first of all that Austria and Serbia would not come to blows. Secondly, that if they did, Russia would not intervene. Thirdly, if Russia intervened, that Germany would not strike. Fourthly, they hoped that if Germany struck at Russia, it ought to be possible for France and Germany mutually to neutralize each other without fighting. They did not believe that if Germany attacked France, she would attack her through Belgium, or that if she did, the Belgians would forcibly resist. And it must be remembered that during the whole course of the week, Belgium not only never asked for assistance from the guaranteeing powers, but pointedly indicated that she wished to be left alone. So here were 6 or 7 positions, all of which could be wrangled over, and about none of which any final proof could be offered except the proofs of events. It was not until Monday, August 3, that the direct appeal from the King of the Belgians for French and British aid raised an issue which united the overwhelming majority of ministers and enabled Sir Edward Grey to make a speech on that afternoon to the House of Commons. My own part in these events was a very simple one. It was first of all to make sure that the diplomatic situation did not get ahead of the naval situation, and that the Grand Fleet should be in its war station before Germany could know whether or not we would be in the war, and therefore, if possible, before we had decided ourselves. Secondly, it was to point out that if Germany attacked France, she would do so through Belgium, that all her preparations had been made to this end, and that she neither could nor would adopt any different strategy or go round any other way. To these 2 tasks I steadfastly adhered. Every day there were long cabinets from 11 onwards, streams of telegrams poured in from every capital in Europe. Sir Edward Grey was plunged in his immense double struggle, A, to prevent war, and B, not to desert France should it come. I watched with admiration his activities at the Foreign Office and cool skill in council. Both these tasks acted and reacted on one another from hour to hour. He had to try to make the Germans realize that we were to be reckoned with, without making the French or Russians feel they had us in their pockets. He had to carry the cabinet with him in all he did. During the many years we acted together in the cabinet, and the earlier years in which I read his Foreign Office telegrams, I thought I had learned to understand his methods of discussion and controversy, and perhaps without offense I might describe them. After what must have been profound reflection and study, the Foreign Secretary was accustomed to select 1 or 2 points in any important controversy, which he defended with all his resources and tenacity. They were his fortified villages. All around in the open field the battle ebbed and flowed, but if at nightfall these points were still in his possession, his battle was won. All other arguments had expended themselves, and these key positions alone survived. The point which he selected over and over again proved to be inexpugnable. They were particularly adapted to defense. They commended themselves to sensible and fair-minded men. The sentiments of the patriotic Whig, the English gentleman, the public schoolboy all came into the line for their defense, and if they were held, the whole front was held, including much debatable ground. As soon as the crisis had begun, he had fastened upon the plan of a European conference, and to this end every conceivable endeavour was made by him. To get the great powers together round a table in any capital that was agreeable, with Britain there to struggle for peace, and if necessary to threaten war against those who broke it, was his plan. Had such a conference taken place, there could have been no war. Mere acceptance of the principle of a conference by the Central Powers would have instantly relieved the tension. A will to peace at Berlin and Vienna would have found no difficulties in escaping from the terrible net which was drawing in upon us all hour by hour. But underneath the diplomatic communications and maneuvers, the baffling proposals and counter-proposals, the agitated interventions of Tsar and Kaiser, flowed a deep tide of calculated military purpose. As the ill-fated nations approached the verge, the sinister machines of war began to develop their own momentum and eventually to take control themselves. The Foreign Secretary's second cardinal point was the English Channel. Whatever happened, if war came, we could not allow the German fleet to come down the Channel to attack the French ports. Such a situation would be insupportable for Great Britain. Everyone who counted was agreed on that from a very early stage in our discussions. But in addition, we were, in a sense, morally committed to France to that extent. No bargain had been entered into. All arrangements that had been concerted were, as has been explained, specifically preluded with a declaration that neither party was committed to anything further than consultation together if danger threatened. But still the fact remained that the whole French fleet was in the Mediterranean. Only a few cruisers and flotillas remained to guard the northern and Atlantic coasts of France, and simultaneously with that redisposition of forces, though not contingent upon it or dependent upon it, we had concentrated all our battleships at home, and only cruisers and battle-cruisers maintained British interests in the Mediterranean. The French had taken their decision on their own responsibility without prompting from us, and we had profited by their action to strengthen our margin in the line of battle at home. Whatever disclaimers we had made about not being committed, could we, when it came to the point, honorably stand by and see the naked French coasts ravaged and bombarded by German dreadnoughts under the ice and within gunshot of our main fleet? It seemed to me, however, very early in the discussion that the Germans would concede this point to keep us out of the war, at any rate till the first battles on land had been fought without us. And sure enough, they did. Believing as I did and do that we could not, for our own safety and independence, allow France to be crushed as the result of aggressive action by Germany, I always, from the very earliest moment, concentrated upon our obligations to Belgium, through which I was convinced the Germans must inevitably march to invade France. Belgium did not count so largely in my sentiments at this stage. I thought it very unlikely that she would resist. I thought, and Lord Kitchener, who lunched with me on the Tuesday, the 28th, agreed that Belgium would make some formal protest and submit. A few shots might be fired outside Liège or Namur, and then this unfortunate state would bow its head before overwhelming might. Perhaps even there was a secret agreement allowing free passage to the Germans through Belgium. How otherwise would all these preparations of Germany, the great camps along the Belgian frontier, the miles and miles of sidings, the intricate network of railways, have been developed? Was it possible that German thoroughness could be astray on so important a factor as the attitude of Belgium? Those wonderful events which took place in Belgium on Sunday and Monday and in the week that followed could not be foreseen by us. I saw in Belgium a country with whom we had many differences over the Congo and other subjects. I had not discerned in the Belgium of the late King Leopold the heroic nation of King Albert. But whatever happened to Belgium, there was France, whose very life was at stake, whose armies, in my judgment, were definitely weaker than those by whom they would be assailed, whose ruin would leave us face to face alone with triumphant Germany. France, in those days schooled by adversity to peace and caution, thoroughly democratic, already stripped of 2 fair provinces, about to receive the final smashing blow from overwhelming brutal force. Only Britain could redress the balance, could defend the fair play of the world. Whatever else failed, we must be there, and we must be there in time. A week later, every British heart burned for little Belgium. From every cottage, labouring men, untrained to war but with the blood of an unconquered people in their veins, were hurrying to the recruiting stations with intent to rescue Belgium. But at this time it was not Belgium one thought of, but France. Still, Belgium and the treaties were indisputably an obligation of honour binding upon the British state, such as British governments have always accepted, and it was on that ground that I personally, with others, took my stand. I will now examine the alternative question of whether more decided action by Sir Edward Grey at an early stage would have prevented the war. We must first ask, at what early stage? Suppose, after Agadir or on the announcement of the new German Navy law in 1912, the Foreign Secretary had, in cool blood, proposed a formal alliance with France and Russia, and in execution of military conventions consequential upon the alliance had begun to raise the compulsion an army adequate to our responsibilities and to the part we were playing in the world's affairs. And suppose we had taken this action as a united nation, who shall say whether that would have prevented or precipitated the war? But what chance was there for such action being unitedly taken? The cabinet of the day would never have agreed to it. I doubt if 4 ministers would have agreed to it. But if the cabinet had been united upon it, the House of Commons would not have accepted their guidance. Therefore the foreign minister would have had to resign. The policy which he had advocated would have stood condemned and perhaps violently repudiated, and with that repudiation would have come an absolute veto upon all those informal preparations and non-committal discussions on which the defensive power of the Triple Entente was erected. Therefore, by taking such a course in 1912, Sir Edward Grey would only have paralyzed Britain, isolated France, and increased the preponderant and growing power of Germany. Suppose again that now, after the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, the Foreign Secretary had proposed to the Cabinet that if matters were so handled that Germany attacked France or violated Belgian territory, Great Britain would declare war upon her. Would the Cabinet have assented to such a communication? I cannot believe it. If Sir Edward Grey could have said on Monday that if Germany attacked France or Belgium, England would declare war upon her, might there not still have been time to ward off the catastrophe? The question is certainly arguable, but the knowledge which we now have of events in Berlin tends to show that even then the German government were too deeply committed by their previous action. They had before their eyes the deliberate British announcement that the fleet was being held together. That at least was a serious, if silent, warning. Under its impression, the German Emperor, as soon as he returned to Berlin, made on this same Monday and succeeding days strong efforts to bring Austria to reason and so to prevent war. But he could never overtake events or withstand the contagion of ideas. However this may be, I am certain that if Sir Edward Grey had sent the kind of ultimatum suggested, the Cabinet would have broken up, and it is also my belief that up till Wednesday or Thursday at least, the House of Commons would have repudiated his action. Nothing less than the deeds of Germany would have converted the British nation to war. To act in advance of those deeds would have led to an exposure of division worse than the guarded attitude which we maintained, which brought our country into the war united. After Wednesday or Thursday it was too late. By the time we could speak decisive words of warning, the hour of words had certainly passed forever. It is true to say that our intent with France and the military and naval conversations that had taken place since 1900 had led us into a position where we had the obligations of an alliance without its advantages. An open alliance, if it could have been peacefully brought about at an earlier date, would have exercised a deterring effect upon the German mind, or at least would have altered their military calculations. Whereas now we were morally bound to come to the aid of France, and it was our interest to do so, and yet the fact that we should come in appeared so uncertain that it did not weigh as it should have done with the Germans. Moreover, as things were, if France had been in an aggressive mood, we should not have had the unquestioned right of an ally to influence her action in a pacific sense. And if, as the result of her aggressive mood, war had broken out and we had stood aside, we should have been accused of deserting her, and in any case would have been ourselves grievously endangered by her defeat. However, in the event, there was no need to moderate the French attitude. Justice to France requires the explicit statement that the conduct of her government at this awful juncture was faultless. She assented instantly to every proposal that could make for peace. She abstained from every form of provocative action. She even compromised her own safety, holding back her covering troops at a considerable distance behind her frontier and delaying her mobilization in the face of continually gathering German forces till the latest moment. Not until she was confronted with the direct demand of Germany to break her treaty and abandon Russia did France take up the challenge. And even had she acceded to the German demand, she would only, as we now know, have been faced with a further ultimatum to surrender to German military occupation as a guarantee for her neutrality the fortresses of Toul and Verdun. Thus, there never was any chance of France being allowed to escape the ordeal. Even cowardice and dishonor would not have saved her. The Germans had resolved that if war came from any cause, they would take and break France forthwith as its first operation. The German military chiefs burned to give the signal, and were sure of the result. She would have begged for mercy in vain. She did not beg. The more I reflect upon this situation, the more convinced I am that we took the only practical course that was open to us or to any British cabinet, and that the objections which may be urged against it were less than those which would have attended any other sequence of action. After hearing the discussions at Monday's cabinet and studying the telegrams, I sent that night to all our commanders-in-chief the following very secret warning. July 27, 1914. This is not the warning telegram, but European political situation makes war between Triple Entente and Triple Alliance powers by no means impossible. Be prepared to shadow possible hostile men of war and consider dispositions of Her Majesty's ships under your command from this point of view. Measure is purely precautionary. No unnecessary person is to be informed. The utmost secrecy is to be observed. On Tuesday morning I sent the following minute to the First Sea Lord, to which he replied marginally the same day. July 28, 1914. First, it would appear that the minesweepers should be quietly collected at some suitable point for attendance on the battle fleet should it move. Reply from the First Sea Lord. Will go north with fleet. Second, let me have a short statement on the coal position and what measures you propose. Reply from the First Sea Lord, done. Third, I presume Firedrake and Lurcher will now join their proper flotilla. Remark from First Sea Lord, yes. Fourth, all the vessels engaged on the coast of Ireland should be considered as available on mobilization, and on receipt of the warning telegram should move to their war stations without the slightest delay. Remark from the First Sea Lord, have been ordered away. Fifth, it would certainly be desirable that Triumph should be quietly mobilized and that she should be ready to close, that is, join the China flagship with available destroyers. The position of the German heavy cruisers in China waters makes it clear that this can be done. Please examine and report what disadvantages this mobilization would entail. We can then discuss whether it is worthwhile taking them in the present circumstances. The China squadron must be capable of concentrating as soon as the warning telegram is sent and before a main action is necessary. Without the Triumph, the margin of superiority is small and any reinforcement from other stations would be slow. Reply from First Sea Lord, will be done as soon as FO concur. Should concentrate at Hong Kong at once. Sixth, you should consider whether the position of the Goeben at Pola does not justify the detachment of the New Zealand to join the Mediterranean flag. Reply from First Sea Lord, decided no at conference. Seventh, yesterday, after consultation with the Prime Minister, I arranged personally with the Chief of the Imperial General Staff for the better guarding of magazines and oil tanks against evilly disposed persons and attacks by aircraft. These measures have now been taken. See attached letter from the Chief of the Imperial General Staff and my reply. You should direct the Director of Operations Division to obtain full detailed information from the War Office of what has been done, and in the event of any place being overlooked, to make the necessary representations. Reply from First Sea Lord, settled personally with C of LGS. Eighth, Director of the Air Division should be asked to report the exact positions of the aircraft which were concentrated yesterday in the neighborhood of the Thames estuary, and further to state what is being done to reach a complete understanding between the aircraft and the military authorities in charge of the aerial gun defenses at various points. This is of the utmost importance if accidents are to be avoided. Remark from First Sea Lord, done. The official warning telegram was dispatched from the Admiralty on Wednesday, the 29th. On this same day I obtained from the Cabinet the authority to put into force the precautionary period regulations. The work of Otley and Hankey, and generally of the Committee of Imperial Defence, was now put to the proof. It was found in every respect thorough and comprehensive, and all over the country emergency measures began to astonish the public. Naval harbours were cleared, bridges were guarded, steamers were boarded and examined, watchers lined the coasts. To the First Sea Lord, Fourth Sea Lord, Director of Air Department, July 29, 1914. In the present stage of aeronautics, the primary duty of British aircraft is to fight enemy aircraft, and thus afford protection against aerial attack. This should be made clear to air officers, Commander-in-Chief, Nor, and Admiral of Patrols, in order that machines may not be needlessly used up in ordinary scouting duties. After the primary requirement is well provided for, whatever aid is possible for coastal watch and extended defense scouting should be organized. But the naval aircraft are to regard the defense against attack from the air as their first and main responsibility. They must be carefully husbanded. Winston as Churchill. And the day before, July 28, 1914, to the Director, Intelligence Division. Please mark off on my table of battleship strength all British and German dreadnought battleships available for war, A, in the next month, and B, at the end of 3 months. You should include the 2 Turkish ships in your calculation. Let me also have a similar table about battle cruisers. Winston as Churchill. Our war arrangements comprised an elaborate scheme for dealing with vessels under construction. In 1912, measures had been taken to keep it perpetually up to date. The principle was that for the first 3 months of a war, all efforts should be concentrated on finishing ships that could be ready in the first 6 months. Other vessels, whose dates of completion were more remote, being somewhat retarded. This ensured the greatest possible superiority in the early months, and would give us time to see what kind of a war it was and how it went, before dealing with more distant contingencies. The plan, of course, covered all ships building in Great Britain for foreign powers. Of these, there were 2 battleships building for Turkey, 3 flotilla leaders for Chile, 4 destroyers for Greece, and 3 monitors for Brazil. There were also other important ships, including a Chilean and a Brazilian battleship and a Dutch cruiser, which would not be ready till much later. The Turkish battleships were vital to us. With a margin of only 7 dreadnoughts, we could not afford to do without these 2 fine ships. Still less could we afford to see them fall into bad hands and possibly be used against us. Had we delivered them to Turkey, they would, as the event turned out, have formed with the Goeben a hostile force which would have required a force of not less than 4 British dreadnought battleships or battlecruisers to watch them. Thus, the British numbers would have been reduced by 2 instead of being increased by 2. One of the Turkish battleships, the Rashide, which Armstrongs were building on the Tyne when the crisis began, was actually complete. The Turkish crew, over 500 strong, had already arrived to take her over and were lying in their steamer in the river. There seemed to be a great danger of their coming on board, brushing aside Messrs. Armstrong's workmen and hoisting the Turkish flag, in which case a very difficult diplomatic situation would have been created. I determined to run no risks, and on July 31 I sent written instructions that adequate military guards were to be placed on board this vessel, and that in no circumstances was she to be boarded by the Turks. It has sometimes been made a ground for reproach against me that the requisition of these ships was one of the causes which brought Turkey into the war 3 months later. We now know that negotiations were taking place from July 24 onwards between the Germans and the leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress for an alliance between Germany and Turkey, and that such alliance was actually signed on August 2. It is interesting to read in the German official history what they knew about our preparations at this time. At 6:20 p.m. on July 28, the following telegram was received in Berlin from the German naval attaché. Admiralty are not publishing ships' movements. Second Fleet remains fully manned. Schools closed in naval bases. Preliminary measures taken for recall from leave. According to unconfirmed news, First Fleet still at Portland. 1 submarine flotilla left Portsmouth. It is to be assumed that Admiralty is preparing for mobilization on the quiet. He telegraphed later on the same day as follows. As already reported by telegram, the British fleet is preparing for all eventualities. In broad outline, the present distribution is as follows. First Fleet is assembled at Portland. The battleship Bellerophon, which was proceeding to Gibraltar for refit, has been recalled. The ships of the Second Fleet are at their bases. They are fully manned. The schools on shore have not reopened. Ships of the second and third fleets have coaled, completed with ammunition and supplies, and are at their bases. In consequence of the training of reservists just completed, later can be manned more quickly than usual and with more or less practiced personnel. The Times says within 48 hours. The destroyer and patrol flotillas and the submarines are either at or en route for their stations. No leave is being granted. Officers and men already on leave have been recalled. In the naval bases and dockyards, great activity reigns. In addition, special measures of precaution have been adopted. All dockyards, magazines, oil tanks, etc. being put under guard. Repairs of ships in dockyard hands are being speeded up. A great deal of night work is being done. The press reports that the Mediterranean squadron had left Alexandria. It is said that it will remain at Malta. All ships and squadrons have orders to remain ready for sea. Outwardly, complete calm is preserved, in order not to cause anxiety by alarming reports about the fleet. Movements of ships, which are generally published daily by the Admiralty, have been withheld since yesterday. The above preparations have been made on the Admiralty's independent initiative. The result is the same, whoever gave the orders. The German naval attaché thus showed himself extremely well informed. As I have already mentioned in an earlier chapter, the general warrants to open the letters of certain persons, which I had signed 3 years before as Home Secretary, had brought to light a regular network of minor agents, mostly British and German pay, in all our naval ports. Had we arrested them, others of whom we might not have known would have taken their place. We therefore thought it better, having detected them, to leave them at large. In this way one saw regularly from their communications, which we carefully forwarded, what they were saying to their paymasters in Berlin during these years, and we knew exactly how to put our hands upon them at the proper moment. Up to this point, we had no objection to the German government knowing that exceptionally precautions were being taken throughout the navy. Indeed, apart from details, it was desirable that they should know how seriously we viewed the situation. But the moment had now come to draw down the curtain. We no longer forwarded the letters, and a few days later, on a word from me to the Home Secretary, all these petty traitors, who for a few pounds a month were seeking to sell their country, were laid by the heels. Nor was it easy for the Germans to organize on the spur of the moment others in their places. The most important step remains to be recounted. As early as Tuesday, July 28, I felt that the fleet should go to its war station. It must go there at once, and secretly. It must be steaming to the north, while every German authority, naval or military, had the greatest possible interest in avoiding a collision with us. If it went thus early, it need not go by the Irish Channel and north about. It could go through the Straits of Dover and through the North Sea, and therefore the island would not be uncovered even for a single day. Moreover, it would arrive sooner and with less expenditure of fuel. At about 10 o'clock, therefore, on the Tuesday morning, I proposed this step to the First Sea Lord and the Chief of the Staff, and found them wholeheartedly in favor of it. We decided that the fleet should leave Portland at such an hour on the morning of the 29th as to pass the Straits of Dover during the hours of darkness, that it should traverse these waters at high speed and without lights, and with the utmost precaution proceed to Scapa Flow. I feared to bring this matter before the Cabinet, lest it should mistakenly be considered a provocative action likely to damage the chances of peace. It would be unusual to bring movements of the British fleet in home waters from one British port to another before the Cabinet. I only therefore informed the Prime Minister, who at once gave his approval. Orders were accordingly sent to Sir George Callaghan, who was told incidentally to send the fleet up under his second-in-command and to travel himself by land through London in order that we might have an opportunity of consultation with him. Admiralty to Commander-in-Chief Home Fleets, July 28, 1914, sent at 5 p.m. Tomorrow, Wednesday, the First Fleet is to leave Portland for Scapa Flow. Destination is to be kept secret except to flag and commanding officers. As you are required at the Admiralty, Vice Admiral 2nd Battle Squadron is to take command. Course from Portland is to be shaped to southward, then a middle channel course to the Straits of Dover. The squadrons are to pass through the straits without lights during the night and to pass outside the shoals on their way north. Agamemnon is to remain at Portland, where the Second Fleet will assemble. We may now picture this great fleet, with its flotillas and cruisers, steaming slowly out of Portland Harbor, squadron by squadron, scores of gigantic castles of steel wending their way across the misty shining sea, like giants bowed in anxious thought. We may picture them again as darkness fell. 18 miles of warships running at high speed and in absolute blackness through the narrow straits, bearing with them into the broad waters of the North Sea the safeguard of considerable affairs. Although there seemed to be no conceivable motive, chance or mischance, which could lead a rational German admiralty to lay a trap of submarines or mines, or have given them the knowledge and the time to do so, we looked at each other with much satisfaction when, on Thursday morning, the 30th, at our daily staff meeting, the flagship reported herself and the whole fleet well out in the center of the North Sea. Footnote. Later in the morning I learned that Lord Fisher was in the office and I invited him into my room. I told him what we had done, and his delight was wonderful to see. Foolish statements have been made from time to time that this sending of the fleet to the north was done at Lord Fisher's suggestion. The interview with me, which Lord Fisher records in his book, is correctly given by him as having taken place on the 30th. The fleet had actually passed the Straits of Dover the night before. I think it necessary to place on record the fact that my sole naval adviser on every measure taken prior to the declaration of war was the First Sea Lord. End of footnote. The German ambassador lost no time in complaining of the movement of the fleet to the Foreign Office. According to the German official naval history, he reported to his government on the evening of the 30th that Sir Edward Grey had answered him in the following words: "The movements of the fleets are free of all offensive character, and the fleet will not approach German waters." But, adds the German historian, the strategic concentration of the fleet had actually been accomplished with its transfer to the Scottish ports. This was true. We were now in a position, whatever happened, to control events, and it was not easy to see how this advantage could be taken from us. A surprise torpedo attack before or simultaneous with the declaration of war was at any rate one nightmare gone forever. We could at least see for 10 days ahead. If war should come, no one would know where to look for the British fleet. Somewhere in the enormous waste of waters to the north of our islands, cruising now this way, now that, shrouded in storms and mists, dwelt this mighty organization. Yet from the Admiralty building we could speak to them at any moment if need arose. The King's ships were at sea.